The train pulled away from the platform at 11:47 p.m., 3 minutes behind schedule. I know this because I'd been watching the digital clock above the departure board for the better part of an hour, waiting. Not for anything in particular, just waiting. I found my seat in car 7, row 12. The ticket said 12A, window seat. But when I slid into the narrow aisle, I realized the train was nearly empty. Maybe 15 people scattered across a car built for 60. I could have sat anywhere. But 12A was mine, so I took it. The overhead lights had been dimmed to that amber twilight setting that makes everything feel suspended, like we were traveling through honey instead of night. Outside, the city was falling away in scattered points of light, becoming something else, becoming distance. I wasn't running from anything, that's what I kept telling myself. I was traveling to Portland, had a cousin there I hadn't seen in 5 years, had promised to visit someday. Someday had arrived with the particular weight that someday carries when you realize you have nowhere else to be. The seat across the aisle, and one row up, was occupied. I noticed this as I settled in, stuffing my duffel bag into the overhead compartment. A man, maybe my age, maybe a little older, dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it too many times, worn leather jacket that had seen better decades. He was looking out the window, chin resting on his fist, watching the world blur past in that particular way people watch things they're not really seeing. I arranged myself carefully, book in the seat pocket, water bottle in the cup holder, phone plugged into the outlet. The rituals of solitary travel. I'd gotten good at taking up exactly the space I was meant to take up, and no more. The train found its rhythm. That particular percussion of steel on steel that sounds like a heartbeat if you're not paying attention, sounds like machinery if you are. I opened my book, something about wolves in Alaska I'd picked up at the station bookstore, but found myself reading the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing a single word. This happens sometimes. The words would sit on top of my mind instead of sinking in like oil on water. I closed the book and looked out my window instead. The man across the aisle shifted in his seat. Not dramatically, just the small movement of someone trying to get comfortable in a space that wasn't quite built for comfort. His reflection caught in the window glass, superimposed over the passing darkness. Dark eyes. A mouth that looked like it knew things it wasn't saying. I looked away. But here's the thing about train travel. There's nowhere to look away to, not really. The windows only show you so much darkness before you start seeing your own reflection staring back. The book wasn't working. The phone had no signal. So your eyes wander and they land on the other people sharing your small traveling world. When I glanced over again, he was looking at me, not staring, not the aggressive eye contact of someone trying to start something, just looking. The way you might look at a painting in a museum, taking it in without judgment. I felt heat rise in my chest, that particular warmth that comes with being seen when you weren't expecting it. I looked away first. Outside, we were somewhere in the space between cities now. That American nowhere land of strip malls and storage units and 24-hour gas stations glowing like lonely islands in the dark. The train's rhythm was hypnotic. I felt my shoulders drop for the first time in weeks. We were moving so fast, but I'd never felt something unfold so slowly. The thought came from nowhere, the way thoughts do sometimes on long journeys when your mind starts to wander in directions it doesn't usually go. I didn't know why I was thinking about unfolding. Nothing was unfolding. I was just a man on a train traveling from one place to another, same as thousands of people did every day. The train lurched slightly as we took a curve, and instinctively I looked up. The man across the aisle was looking up too, both of us responding to the same small disruption in our shared equilibrium. Our eyes met. This time, neither of us looked away. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, maybe 5. Long enough for me to notice that his eyes weren't just dark. They were brown with flecks of something lighter. Long enough for something to pass between us that wasn't quite a smile, wasn't quite recognition, but was definitely something. Then the moment passed. He went back to his window. I went back to mine. But something had shifted. The air in the car felt different, more charged. Like the static electricity that builds before a storm, except there was no storm coming. Just two strangers sharing space and time and the particular intimacy of night travel. An hour passed, maybe 2. Time moves differently on trains, especially night trains. The landscape outside had become completely abstract, just darkness punctuated by occasional clusters of light that could have been towns or truck stops or alien settlements for all I could tell. I was starting to doze when I heard footsteps in the aisle. The man in the leather jacket was walking past my seat, heading toward the front of the car. He moved quietly, like someone who was used to not disturbing sleeping strangers. As he passed, I caught a whiff of something, not cologne, but soap and leather, and something else that I couldn't identify. Something that made me want to breathe deeper. He was gone for maybe 10 minutes. When he came back, he paused beside my seat, not hovering, just pausing. Like someone who was about to say something and then thought better of it. Instead, he held out his hand. In his palm was a granola bar, one of those expensive organic ones with nuts and dried fruit. "You look hungry," he said. His voice was quieter than I'd expected, a little rough around the edges like he didn't use it much. I wasn't hungry, hadn't been hungry for days actually. Food had become just another thing to get through, like sleep or conversation or the space between morning and night. But something about the gesture, the small kindness of it, the way he wasn't making a big deal out of it, made me reach out and take it. "Thanks," I said. He nodded and continued to his seat. That was it. No further conversation, just a granola bar and a moment of human consideration. I held it in my hands for a long time before opening it. When I finally did eat it, it tasted better than anything I'd eaten in weeks. Another hour passed. The granola bar sat in my stomach like a small, warm stone. The first food that had felt like nourishment instead of obligation in longer than I wanted to think about. I found myself glancing toward the man's seat more frequently now. Not staring. I'd learned my lesson about staring, but checking, making sure he was still there. He wasn't trying to be charming. He wasn't trying at all. That's what disarmed me. The thought arrived fully formed, like something I'd been thinking for a while without realizing it. Most people, when they wanted to connect, they tried so hard. They performed their interest, their availability, their charm. This man hadn't performed anything. He just offered food to a stranger who looked like he might need it. Simple, honest, disarming. Around 2 a.m., I know because I'd started checking the time compulsively, the way you do when normal sleep patterns have abandoned you. He spoke again. "You traveling to or from?" His voice carried easily across the aisle in the quiet car. Most of our fellow passengers had settled into various forms of sleep, leaving us in a bubble of wakefulness. I considered the question. It felt loaded, like there was a right answer and a wrong answer, and I wasn't sure which was which. "Does it matter?" I said finally. He turned from the window to look at me directly. There was something in his expression I couldn't read. Not amusement exactly, but not surprise either. "Not really," he said. We fell back into silence, but it felt different now. Less like two strangers ignoring each other, more like two people who understood that sometimes the most honest conversations happen in the spaces between words. The train clicked and swayed through the darkness. I found myself thinking about momentum. How once something gets moving, it wants to keep moving. How it takes more energy to stop than to continue. I wasn't sure if I was thinking about the train or something else. "I'm Cal," he said eventually. Not like he was expecting anything in return, just like he was offering information that might be useful. "David," I said. He nodded like this made sense. Like David was exactly what he'd expected my name to be. Maybe it was. Maybe I looked like a David, whatever that meant. "Long trip?" he asked. "Portland. That's where I'm headed to." This should have been a bigger coincidence than it felt. The train made several stops between here and there. Sacramento, Eugene, other places I couldn't remember. But somehow it seemed perfectly natural that we'd be going to the same place. Like the universe had arranged it. "You know anyone there?" I asked. "Not really." He paused. "You?" "Cousin. Haven't seen him in 5 years." Cal nodded. "Family," he said, and something in the way he said it suggested he understood both the comfort and the complication of that word. We talked like this for another hour. Sparse, fragmented conversations that revealed more in what wasn't said than what was. I learned that he'd been traveling for 3 days, that he'd started somewhere in the South, Mississippi maybe, or Alabama, that he had a job waiting in Portland, though he didn't say what kind. I found myself telling him things I hadn't planned to tell anyone. About the cousin, yes, but also about the apartment I'd left behind. About how it had started to feel like a place where someone else used to live. About how sometimes you wake up and realize you've been sleepwalking through your own life. I didn't tell him about Marcus. Didn't tell him about the 8 months that had ended 3 weeks ago with a conversation that was quieter and more devastating than any fight. Didn't tell him about the family dinners I'd stopped attending, the friends who'd stopped calling, the gradual erosion of all the connections that were supposed to make life meaningful. But somehow, in the space between what I said and what I didn't say, Cal seemed to understand. He listened with the particular attention of someone who knew about loss, about the way it could hollow you out and leave you lighter, but not necessarily better. There are people you meet once, and somehow they know something about you you haven't told anyone. The thought came as I was watching him look out the window again. His reflection ghosted over the passing darkness. His profile was sharp in the amber light, strong jaw, straight nose, the kind of bone structure that photographs well but looks even better in person. But it wasn't his looks that had caught my attention. It was something else, some quality of stillness that matched my own. Around 4 a.m., the train made a stop in some small city I didn't catch the name of. A handful of passengers got off. Fewer got on. The platform was lit by harsh fluorescent lights that made everyone look tired and slightly haunted. Cal and I watched through our respective windows as people said goodbye, as they wheeled suitcases across concrete, as they disappeared into cars and taxis in the kind of early morning darkness that feels different from late night darkness. You ever wonder where they're all going? He asked. The passengers? All of them. Everyone. Like, what's the actual destination? Not the city, but the reason. I considered this. You mean like, what are they hoping to find? Something like that. I watched a woman in a red coat hug a man who might have been her father, or her brother, or just someone she was glad to see. They held each other for a long time before she got back on the train. I think most people are trying to get back to something, I said. Some version of themselves they lost somewhere along the way. Cal looked at me. Really looked, like he was trying to see if I believed what I'd just said. What about you? He asked. The question hung in the air between us. The train started moving again, pulling away from the platform, from the harsh lights, back into the softer darkness of traveling. I don't know yet, I said, and realized it was the most honest thing I'd said in months. The sky outside was starting to change. Not lighter exactly, but less dense. That particular quality of very early morning when the world starts to remember that daylight exists, even if it's still hours away. Cal stretched in his seat, rolling his shoulders. I'm going to walk around a bit, he said. Stretch my legs. I nodded, watched him stand, watched him move into the aisle, with that same quiet grace I'd noticed before. He paused at my seat. Want to come? I'd been sitting for hours. My back was stiff, my legs restless. But more than that, I realized I didn't want to let him out of my sight. Not because I was worried he'd disappear, though maybe I was a little, but because being near him had started to feel like the most natural thing in the world. Yeah, I said. Okay. We walked toward the back of the train, through our nearly empty car and into the next one, which was completely empty. The lights were dimmed even lower here, creating pools of amber illumination separated by stretches of shadow. Our footsteps were muffled by the carpet, but the train's rhythm was louder somehow, more present. At the back of the car, there were large windows on either side. Cal stopped there, looking out at the landscape rushing past. I stopped beside him, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough that when the train swayed slightly, our shoulders brushed. Neither of us moved away. Outside, the world was a blur of dark shapes against a sky that was slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to lighten. Trees, fields, the occasional farmhouse, with a single light burning in an upstairs window. People sleeping, people waking, people living their lives in all the spaces our train was rushing through. It's strange, Cal said quietly, how fast we're moving, but how still it feels in here. I knew what he meant. The train was doing 70, 80 miles an hour, eating up distance, carrying us inexorably toward our destination. But standing here beside him, watching the world blur past, I felt suspended. Like we were existing in a pocket outside of time, where the normal rules of speed and distance didn't apply. Like we're not really going anywhere, I said. Just existing in the going. He turned to look at me, and I was struck again by his eyes. Brown with those lighter flecks, but more than that, patient. Like he had all the time in the world to see whatever it was he was looking for. Exactly, he said. We stood there for what might have been 5 minutes or 20. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was full, rich, like a conversation we were having without words. I found myself very aware of his breathing, the small movements he made to maintain his balance as the train swayed, the way his reflection in the window overlapped with mine, creating a composite image that looked like something entirely new. When we finally walked back to our seats, something had changed again, not dramatically, We were still two strangers on a train, still careful with each other, still operating in the realm of almost conversations and sideways glances. But the space between us felt smaller somehow, more intimate. Cal settled back into his seat across the aisle. I settled into mine. But the memory of standing shoulder to shoulder, of sharing that view of the blurred world rushing past, sat between us like a secret we were both keeping. The train rolled on through the pre-dawn darkness. I dozed fitfully, aware even in sleep of Cal's presence, of the sound of his breathing, of the way he shifted occasionally in his seat. When I woke, pale gray light was seeping in through the windows, and he was watching me. "Sorry," he said quietly when he saw I was awake. "Didn't mean to stare." "It's okay," I said, and meant it. Being looked at by Cal didn't feel invasive the way it usually did when strangers watched me sleep. It felt protective somehow, like he'd been keeping watch. "We're in Oregon," he said. "Another few hours to Portland." I nodded, trying to ignore the small pang of disappointment that came with the reminder that this journey had an endpoint. That whatever this was, this connection, this understanding, this careful dance we'd been doing around each other, it would end when the train pulled into Union Station. The morning light revealed details that had been hidden in the darkness. Cal's jacket was more worn than I'd realized, soft with age and use. His hands, wrapped around a cup of coffee he'd gotten from somewhere, were long-fingered and graceful. There was a small scar on his left temple, almost hidden by his hair. He caught me looking and smiled. The first real smile I'd seen from him. It transformed his face completely, made him look younger and more open and devastatingly handsome. "Coffee?" he asked, holding up a second cup I hadn't noticed. "Got it from the cafe car. Figured you might want some." I accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping my hands around its warmth. The coffee was surprisingly good, rich and dark, with just enough bite to cut through the fog of interrupted sleep. "Thank you," I said. "You didn't have to—" "I know," and he said simply. We drank our coffee in comfortable silence as Oregon rolled past the windows. The landscape was different here, more green, more lush, with that particular quality of Pacific Northwest light that makes everything look like it's been washed clean. Mountains in the distance, forests that seemed to go on forever, small towns that looked like they'd been carved out of fairy tales. "It's beautiful," I said. "Yeah." Cal was looking out the window, but when I glanced over, I caught him looking at me instead. "It is." Something passed between us in that moment. Not quite a flirtation, not quite an acknowledgement, but definitely something. Something that made my chest feel tight and warm and hopeful in a way I hadn't felt in a very long time. The train began to slow as we approached a station. Not Portland, we still had hours to go, but some smaller city where a few passengers would get off, a few would get on. The usual rhythm of long-distance travel. I found myself hoping no one would sit near us. The car was still mostly empty, but train seats filled up as you got closer to major destinations. I wanted to preserve this bubble we'd created, this space where it was just Cal and me in the particular intimacy of shared time. As if reading my thoughts, Cal spoke. "When we get to Portland," he said, not looking at me, do you have plans? Right away?" My heart did something complicated. A skip. A flutter. Something that felt like hope and terror in equal measure. "Not right away?" I said carefully. "There's this coffee place. Near the station. A friend mentioned it." He paused, seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "If you wanted to extend the conversation away from the train." I looked at him, really looked, trying to read what was behind the offer. What he was hoping for, what he was afraid of, what I was hoping for, what I was afraid of. "I'd like that," I said. He smiled again, that same transformative expression that made everything in the train car seem brighter. "Good," he said. "Good." The next few hours passed in a different kind of tension. Not the careful, getting-to-know-you tension of the night before, but the anticipation of something that might be beginning. We talked more openly now, about books, about places we'd lived, about the small observations that fill up a life when you're paying attention. I learned that Cal had studied literature in college, but worked in construction, that he'd been living in Alabama, working on a project to restore an old plantation house, and had decided it was time to move on. That he read poetry, though he said this like he was admitting to some kind of secret vice. I told him about my job at the insurance company, about the apartment I'd left behind, about how I'd always meant to travel more, but somehow never had. I didn't tell him about Marcus, but I found myself talking around the edges of it, about feeling stuck, about realizing that the life you think you want and the life that actually makes you happy aren't always the same thing. He listened to everything with that same patient attention, asking questions that showed he was really hearing what I said. It had been so long since someone had listened to me like that. Not waiting for their turn to talk, not looking for the quick fix or the easy answer, just listening. Around noon, the train pulled into Eugene. We watched more passengers board, including a family with young children who filled the car with noise and energy. The contrast was jarring after our hours of quiet conversation, but somehow it made the space between Cal and me feel even more private, even more special. Portland in 2 hours, the conductor announced over the intercom. Cal and I looked at each other. 2 hours felt like forever and no time at all. Are you nervous? He asked quietly. About what? Getting there, starting over, whatever you're going to Portland to do. I considered the question. I think I've been nervous for so long I don't know how to feel anything else, I said, but less nervous than yesterday, less nervous than I was when I got on this train. Good, he said. That's good. The afternoon light slanted through the windows as we traveled north through the Willamette Valley. The landscape was pastoral and green, dotted with farms and vineyards and small towns that looked like they belonged in a different century. It was the kind of scenery that made you understand why people wrote songs about train travel, about the romance of movement, about the way a journey could change you even before you reached your destination. I was thinking about this, about change, about journeys, about the strange alchemy that had transformed 24 hours with a stranger into something that felt significant. When Cal stood up, restroom, he said simply. I nodded, watched him walk away with that same quiet grace I'd been noticing since the beginning. When he disappeared around the corner, I felt his absence like a physical thing. The car seemed quieter, emptier, less interesting without him in it. I closed my eyes and tried to name what I was feeling. Not just attraction, though, that was certainly part of it. Not just gratitude for his kindness, though that was part of it too. Something bigger, more complex. Something that felt like recognition, like finding something I hadn't known I was looking for. When the footsteps approached 10 minutes later, I opened my eyes expecting to see Cal returning to his seat across the aisle. Instead, he paused beside my row. Not in the aisle, not hovering, just pausing. Then, without a word, he slid into the empty seat beside me. Not across from me anymore. Beside me. Close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body. Close enough that when he settled in, our arms brushed where they rested on the shared armrest. He didn't say anything, didn't explain the move or ask if it was okay or make any kind of big deal about it. He just sat there, looking out the window as if this was where he'd always been sitting. The train hummed beneath us. Outside, Oregon rolled past in all its green glory. And between us, in the space of maybe 6 inches, the air seemed to vibrate with possibility. I didn't move my arm away from his. He didn't move his away from mine. The afternoon light began to fade as we approached the end of our journey. Soon we would pull into Portland. Soon we would gather our belongings and step off this train and back into the world of solid ground and separate lives and all the complications that came with them. But for now, we were still moving. Still suspended in this traveling space where normal rules didn't seem to apply. Still discovering what it felt like to sit beside someone who understood something about you that you hadn't had to explain. The train carried us forward through the gathering dusk, and I closed my eyes and let myself feel it. The movement, the momentum, the sense that something was beginning even as something else was coming to an end. Outside, the lights of Portland began to appear in the distance. To be continued. Part 2, the train swayed gently as we rounded a curve, and I felt the subtle pressure of Cal's arm against mine shift and settle. Neither of us moved to break the contact. The simple fact of sitting beside him felt monumental and completely natural at the same time, like something that should have been complicated but wasn't. Outside, the Oregon landscape had dissolved into darkness, punctuated by scattered house lights. Inside, the amber glow of the overhead lights cast everything in sepia tones, making the whole car feel like a photograph from another era. Most of our fellow passengers had settled into sleep, leaving us in a cocoon of quiet that felt both intimate and vast. Cal, he said suddenly. So quietly, I almost missed it over the train's rhythm. I turned to look at him, confused. My name, he clarified, still looking straight ahead through the window. It's Cal, short for Calvin, but no one's called me that since my grandmother died. There was something reluctant in the way he offered this information, like he was giving me something precious that he didn't usually share. Like names were more than just labels. They were keys to rooms in yourself that you normally kept locked. David, I said, though he already knew this. But saying it now in response to his confession felt different. Felt like I was offering something in return, a secret traded, not a fact shared. He nodded, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. David, he repeated, like he was testing how it sounded in his voice, like he was memorizing it. The miles rolled beneath us. I found myself hyper-aware of every small movement Cal made. The way he shifted his weight, the rhythm of his breathing, the occasional gesture he made with his free hand when he spoke. I was cataloging these details without meaning to, storing them like souvenirs from a place I might never visit again. You said you don't know anyone in Portland, I said after a while. Not really. I know someone who knows someone. That's how I got the job. He paused. Construction work. Restoration project on some old buildings downtown. That's good. Steady work. Yeah. He was quiet for a moment. What about you? Your cousin? Ben, he's a teacher. Elementary school. We used to be close when we were kids, but you know how it is. Life gets in the way. Cal nodded. Family's complicated. Something in his tone suggested this was an understatement. I waited to see if he'd elaborate, but he didn't. I was learning that Cal measured his words carefully, that he gave you pieces of himself, slowly, like someone who'd learned to be careful with trust. The train began to slow as we approached another small station. I couldn't make out the name in the darkness, just a platform lit by a few lonely streetlights and a small building that might have been charming in daylight but looked ghostly now. A handful of passengers stirred, gathering their belongings. The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing our stop, though I didn't catch the name. Cal and I both turned to watch the brief ballet of people disembarking. Quick hugs, hurried goodbyes, the shuffle of luggage wheels on platform concrete. Ever wonder about them? Cal asked, echoing his question from earlier. Where they're going, what they're hoping to find? I watched a young woman in a red coat embrace an older man who might have been her father. They held each other for a long moment before she stepped back onto the train. I think most people are looking for the same thing, I said. Some version of home, someplace where they can be themselves without having to explain it. Cal turned to look at me, and I felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. What about you? Is that what you're looking for? The question hung in the air between us. The train lurched slightly as we pulled away from the station, back into the flowing darkness of travel. I don't know, I said honestly. I thought I had that. Home, I mean. And then one day I woke up and realized I'd been living in someone else's idea of what my life should look like. I hadn't meant to say so much, hadn't meant to reveal the hollow feeling that had been growing in my chest for months before I'd finally acknowledged it. But something about Cal's quiet attention made honesty feel safer than it usually did. That's why you left, he said. Not a question. That's why I left. He nodded slowly, and I had the sense that he understood more than I'd actually told him. That maybe he'd felt something similar, that hollow recognition of living someone else's life. The rhythm of the train was hypnotic. I felt my eyelids getting heavy, not from tiredness exactly, but from the strange peace that had settled over me since Cal had moved to sit beside me. For the first time in months, I felt settled, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I must have dozed off because I woke to find my head resting against Cal's shoulder. The train was still moving, still carrying us through the Oregon night, but something had shifted. Cal hadn't moved away. His shoulder was solid and warm beneath my cheek, and I could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing. I should have pulled away immediately, should have apologized for the invasion of his personal space. But something kept me still. The comfortable weight of sleep, yes, but more than that. The realization that this small intimacy felt right in a way that surprised me. Cal's hand moved slightly, not to push me away, but to settle more comfortably on the armrest between us. His fingers brushed against mine, and neither of us pulled back. Sorry, I murmured, finally lifting my head. Didn't mean to. It's okay, he said quietly. You weren't heavy. But I could see in his eyes that it had been more than okay. That maybe he'd needed the contact as much as I had. I settled back into my own space, but the memory of that warmth, that solid presence, lingered like an echo. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the dark landscape roll past, both of us probably thinking about what had just happened and what it might mean. Around midnight, though time had become fluid on the train, marked more by the rhythm of stops and starts than by any clock, Cal stood up. Want to get some coffee? He asked. The dining car should still be open. I wasn't particularly thirsty, but I nodded anyway. The idea of moving through the train with him, of sitting across from each other in a different space, felt like a natural progression of whatever this was becoming. The dining car was nearly empty, just us and an elderly woman reading a paperback novel at a corner table. The fluorescent lights were harsh after the amber glow of our passenger car, making everything feel more immediate, more real. Cal got us 2 cups of coffee from the self-serve station. The coffee was lukewarm and institutional, the kind of brew that prioritized convenience over flavor. But holding the warm cup in my hands felt good, and sitting across from Cal at a small table felt like a different kind of intimacy than sharing the armrest. So, I said, wrapping my fingers around the cup. Alabama. Mississippi, actually, but close, he smiled. The job was in Alabama, restoring this old plantation house. Beautiful architecture, terrible history. Is that what you do, restoration? Sometimes. I'm good with old things. Old buildings have their own language, you know? You have to listen to them, figure out what they need. I watched his hands as he spoke. Long fingers, calloused palms, a thin scar across his knuckles that spoke of work that wasn't always gentle. They were beautiful hands, competent and careful. What made you leave? I asked. He was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. The owner? He said finally. Nice enough guy, but he kept talking about the charm of the antebellum period, about preserving the authentic experience for tourists. And I kept thinking about all the people who lived and died there, who would never be part of that experience, all the stories that weren't being preserved. I nodded, understanding. Must have been hard to work on something when you knew the full story. That's exactly it. His eyes lit up with recognition. Most people don't get that. They think a job is just a job, that you can separate the work from everything else. But you can't, I said. Not if you want to sleep at night. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping our lukewarm coffee and listening to the train's rhythm change as we took a series of curves. The elderly woman at the corner table had put down her book and was dozing in her chair, her head tilted at an angle that looked uncomfortable but peaceful. I don't know why I'm telling you this, I said suddenly. The words came out before I'd fully formed the thought behind them. Cal looked at me with those patient brown eyes. Because we're moving, he said, and we won't be in the same place twice. It was such a simple observation, but it felt profound in the moment. The transience of travel, the way it created a space outside of normal life where different rules applied, where you could tell strangers things you'd never told friends, where honesty felt safer because it was temporary. Is that why you're talking to me? I asked. Because it's safe? He considered this for a moment. Partly, he said, but also because... He paused, searching for the right words. Because you look like someone who understands about leaving. Understand what about it? That sometimes it's not about running away. Sometimes it's about running towards something you can't quite name yet. I felt something shift in my chest at his words. A recognition, a relief at being seen so clearly by someone who barely knew me. What are you running toward? I asked. I don't know yet, he said, echoing my earlier words. But I'll know it when I find it. The train began to slow again, as we approached another station. This one was larger than the last. I could see more lights, more buildings, signs of actual civilization rather than just a platform in the darkness. Salem, Cal said, reading the station sign as we pulled in. We're getting close to Portland. A flutter of something, anticipation, anxiety, regret, moved through my stomach. Part of me wanted to ask how much farther we had to go, but part of me didn't want to know. Didn't want to start the countdown to the end of whatever this was. More passengers boarded at Salem, filling some of the empty seats in our car. The presence of other people changed the dynamic somehow, made our quiet conversation feel more precious, more private. When we made our way back to our seats, I was hyper-aware of every step, every moment. The way Cal moved ahead of me in the narrow aisle, the brief touch of his hand on my shoulder when he gestured for me to go first, the small smile he gave me as we settled back into our side-by-side seats. Better than the dining car, he said, settling in. Yeah, I agreed, though it wasn't really about comfort. It was about proximity, about the particular intimacy of shared space. The new passengers had brought with them the energy of people who were traveling for normal reasons: business trips, family visits, vacation plans. Their quiet conversations about schedules and connections and who would pick them up at the station reminded me that most travel was practical, mundane. That what Cal and I were doing, this slow discovery of each other, this careful intimacy, was something else entirely. Can I show you something? Cal asked suddenly. I nodded, curious. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. Worn leather, soft with age and use. From one of the inner compartments, he extracted a small photograph. Not a modern photo, but the kind printed on real photographic paper, with the slightly faded quality of pictures from another era. He handed it to me carefully, like it was fragile. The photograph showed a young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, sitting on the porch steps of what looked like a farmhouse. The boy had Cal's eyes, Cal's serious expression, but there was something lighter about his face, something more open. Me, Cal said quietly, at my grandmother's house in Mississippi. I looked more closely at the photo. The boy was wearing overalls and a striped shirt, and his feet were bare. Behind him, partially visible through the screen door, was the shadow of a woman, presumably the grandmother. She raised me, Cal continued. My parents weren't really equipped for kids, too caught up in their own problems, so I lived with her from the time I was 5 until she died when I was 16. I handed the photograph back to him, careful not to touch the surface. She looks like she was a good grandmother. The best. He looked down at the photo for a moment, before sliding it back into his wallet. She's the one who taught me about old buildings, actually. Her house was built in 1890, and she knew every story about it. Who had lived there, what changes they'd made, why the kitchen was added on in 1920, why there was a door to nowhere on the second floor. Door to nowhere? Previous owners had planned to build a balcony but ran out of money. So there was just this door that opened onto empty space. My grandmother never fixed it. Said it was a reminder that not every plan works out the way you expect. I thought about this. About doors that led to empty space, about plans that didn't work out, about the way sometimes the broken parts of a place could be more meaningful than the parts that worked perfectly. Is that why you do restoration? I asked. Because of her? Partly. She always said buildings have memories, that if you know how to listen, they'll tell you their stories. He paused. I like that idea. That nothing is ever really lost, just waiting for someone to pay attention. There was something in his voice when he talked about his grandmother, a warmth, a reverence, but also a sadness that ran deeper than simple grief. I had the sense that losing her had been more than losing family. It had been losing his sense of home. Where did you go? I asked gently, after she died. Back to my parents for a while. Then foster care, then... He shrugged. Figured it out as I went. The simplicity of his words didn't hide the complexity of what he wasn't saying. I could fill in some of the gaps. The difficulty of being shuffled between homes, of learning to rely on yourself when the adults in your life couldn't be counted on, of carrying the memory of one person's love through years of uncertainty. That's where the sadness comes from, I said without thinking. He looked at me sharply. What sadness? In your eyes. I noticed it when I first saw you. You have sad eyes. For a moment, I thought I'd said too much. Crossed some invisible line by naming something he hadn't offered to share. But then his expression softened. Yeah, he said quietly. I guess I do. We fell into another silence, but this one felt different, heavier, more charged with things said and unsaid. I was acutely aware of the fact that Cal had chosen to share something deeply personal with me, had trusted me with a piece of his story that probably wasn't easy to tell. Thank you, I said. For what? For showing me the picture, for telling me about your grandmother. He nodded, understanding. Thank you for listening. The train was moving through more populated areas now. Instead of isolated farmhouses and small towns, we were passing suburban developments, shopping centers, the infrastructure of a real city. The lights outside were more frequent, creating a steady stream of illumination that made the interior of the train feel more intimate by contrast. We're close, Cal said, though he didn't sound happy about it. Yeah. Neither of us said what we were both thinking. That close meant the end of whatever this was. That in an hour, maybe 2, we would gather our belongings and step off this train and back into the world of separate lives and real consequences, and all the complications that came with them. Found myself memorizing details about this moment. The way Cal's shoulder felt pressed against mine, the particular quality of light in the train car, the sound of his breathing beneath the rhythm of steel on steel, like I was trying to capture something I could take with me when this ended. David, Cal said, and something in his tone made me turn to look at him fully. Yeah? I don't usually do this. Do what? Talk to people, stay in the same seat for a whole journey. Let strangers. He gestured vaguely at the space between us. I usually keep to myself. I waited for him to continue, sensing there was more what he wanted to say. But this, he said, his eyes meeting mine, this feels different. My heart did something complicated in my chest, a skip, a flutter, something that felt like recognition and fear and hope all tangled together. Different how? I asked. Like maybe some conversations are worth having, even if they can't go anywhere. The train began to slow again, and I felt that familiar flutter of anxiety in my stomach. But this time it was stronger, more urgent. This time I realized with a start, we were approaching Portland. The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom. Next stop, Portland Union Station. Portland, Oregon. Please gather your belongings and prepare to disembark. I looked at Cal, and he looked back at me, and for a moment, we just sat there in the face of inevitability. The journey was ending. Whatever this had been, like this careful getting to know you, this slow building of intimacy, this recognition of something I couldn't quite name, it was about to be over. Well, I said inadequately. Well, Cal agreed. Around us, other passengers were stirring, reaching for bags, checking phones, doing all the small things that marked the transition from traveling to arriving. But Cal and I sat still, neither of us quite ready to break the spell. I started, then stopped. Should what? Get my bag, say goodbye, pretend this had been just a pleasant way to pass the time? The train was slowing more noticeably now. Outside the windows, I could see the lights of Portland getting brighter, more numerous. The urban landscape of a real city after hours of darkness in small towns. I stood up finally because sitting still wasn't going to stop time or keep us traveling forever. My legs were stiff from hours of sitting, and I had to steady myself against the seat back as the train swayed. Cal stood too, and for a moment we were face to face in the narrow space between the seats, closer than we'd been all night. I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could smell that subtle scent of soap and leather, and something uniquely him. I guess this is it, I said. I guess so. But neither of us moved to gather our belongings or head toward the door. We just stood there, looking at each other, both of us trying to figure out how to end something that had felt important without making it into more than it was. The train shuddered to a stop, and the spell was broken. Around us, passengers were moving toward the exits, the car filling with the energy of arrival. I reached up to get my duffel bag from the overhead compartment, and Cal did the same. Take care of yourself, he said as we joined the slow-moving line toward the door. You two. We shuffled forward with the other passengers, not talking now because there were too many people around. Because the moment for intimate conversation had passed. Because we were almost at the threshold between this traveling world and the real world outside. At the door, I paused. The platform stretched out ahead of me, full of people greeting each other, saying goodbye, hurrying toward destinations I couldn't imagine. The air was cool and damp, quintessentially Pacific Northwest, carrying the scent of rain and evergreen and the particular smell of a city at night. I turned around. Cal was still on the train, still in line behind the other passengers, but he was looking directly at me. Not at the door, not at the platform, but at me specifically. Our eyes met across the space between the train and the platform, and for a moment, everything else faded away. We didn't speak. We didn't wave. We didn't make any gesture that would have marked this as a definitive goodbye or as something that might continue. We just looked at each other, really looked like we were trying to memorize each other's faces, trying to capture something we could carry with us when this moment ended. The person behind me was waiting to get off the train, so I stepped onto the platform. But I kept looking back, kept holding that eye contact like a thread between us until other passengers moved between us and I couldn't see him anymore. I walked through the station, past the information desk and the coffee stands and the people waiting for late trains, carrying my duffel bag and the strange weight of something that felt like loss and gratitude and possibility all at once. Outside, Portland spread out in all directions. A city full of people I didn't know, streets I'd never walked, opportunities I couldn't yet imagine. My cousin Ben was supposed to pick me up, though I realized I should probably call him to confirm he was actually coming. But before I did any of that, I stood for a moment in the cool night air and thought about the train pulling away behind me. About Cal, wherever he was going, whatever he was planning to do next. About the conversation we'd shared, the silences we'd filled with something more meaningful than words. We were strangers, I thought. But the silence we shared stayed louder than most conversations I've had in my life. The night was full of possibility, in the city ahead of me, in the cousin I was about to reconnect with, in the chance to build something new from the pieces of the life I'd left behind. But part of me was still on that train, still sitting beside someone who had understood something about leaving and arriving and the space in between. I pulled out my phone to call Ben, but before I dialed, I looked back toward the station one more time. The train was gone, disappeared into the network of tracks that would carry it to other cities, other destinations, other passengers who might find what Cal and I had found in the space between departure and arrival. Some stories end with phone numbers exchanged, with plans made, with promises to stay in touch. But this wasn't that kind of story. This was about the temporary intimacy of travel, about the way strangers could touch each other's lives briefly but meaningfully, about the conversations that happen in the spaces between one life and another. I dialed Ben's number and waited for him to answer, ready to begin whatever came next. But I carried with me the memory of brown eyes and patient listening and the particular warmth of sitting beside someone who understood about leaving and arriving and all the uncertain territory in between. Fade to black. E.